The Alpha King's heart shattered after discovering the truth behind his Beta's daughter's scars. The basement had no windows, which meant Neve Harlow had long ago stopped knowing what time truly meant, stopped understanding the rhythm of days in any way except by the single meal that appeared each evening, slid through a slot in the iron door by hands she never saw, accompanied by silence so complete it felt like another form of violence. She had learned to mark time differently, in the ache of her bones against the thin mattress, in the slow fade of bruises from purple to yellow to gone, in the careful rationing of the candle stub she was permitted each week, burning it only long enough to treat her wounds before darkness reclaimed everything. 2,920 days, she thought, running her fingers along the silver collar that encircled her throat, the metal always cold, always present, a weight she had learned to carry the way she had learned to carry everything else, with silent endurance and a careful blankness that kept the screaming locked somewhere deep inside where it could not escape and bring further punishment. 8 years, exactly 8 years since the night everything had changed, though the details of that change remained frustratingly, agonizingly unclear, hidden behind a fog that felt less like forgotten memory and more like amputation, a piece of herself cut away so cleanly she could still feel the ghost of what was missing. The stone walls of her prison were older than her suffering, part of the Harlow estate's foundation, rooms that had perhaps once stored wine or preserved food, now repurposed to store her, to keep hidden what Beta William Harlow called his daughter, though the word always tasted wrong in her mouth, always felt like a costume that did not quite fit. She had a mirror, cracked and small, propped on the single wooden shelf that held her few possessions, 3 books with pages soft from repeated reading, a basin for washing, a comb missing half its teeth. She used the mirror now, studying her reflection in the weak light of dawn that somehow filtered down through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a face that was all angles and shadows, pale skin stretched over delicate bones, ice-blue eyes that seemed too large, too stark against the pallor, silver-white hair that fell past her shoulders. Holders and tangles she could never quite smooth. The scars were worse in morning light, raised and angry even after all this time, crisscrossing her shoulders and upper back in patterns she had learned not to think about. Burn marks on her forearms from the silver poker her father favored when she displeased him. Thin white lines along her ribs from the time she had looked too long at a visiting pack member, had let her gaze linger with something that might have been hope or hunger for connection, for proof that a world existed beyond these walls. William had reminded her then, as he reminded her often, that she was defective, damaged, shameful, that the collar she wore was for her own protection as much as everyone else's, that her weakness was a burden he bore with patience that she should be grateful for, should never, ever test. She treated the newest wound carefully, a burn 3 days old on the inside of her left arm, circular and precise, the metal still carrying heat when he had pressed it against her skin, his voice calm, almost gentle, explaining that she needed to learn, needed to understand that defiance carried consequences, that looking up when she should look down, speaking when she should stay silent, these were luxuries she had not earned and would not be permitted. The salve she had made from smuggled herbs, stolen during the brief moments when the servant girl brought food, and sometimes, rarely, left the door unlocked for precious seconds, stung as she applied it. But the pain was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability, something she could control when everything else spiraled beyond her grasp. Sometimes she dreamed, fragments of impossible things, running through snow that sparkled under moonlight, a woman with hair like hers singing in a language she almost recognized, warmth and safety and belonging so intense it felt like drowning, like flying, like something her waking mind could not reconcile with the reality of stone and darkness and the constant ache of hunger that had become her baseline, her normal. She would wake from these dreams gasping, the collar burning cold against her throat, a headache splitting her skull, as though the act of remembering, even in sleep, was forbidden, was punished by forces she could not see or fight or understand. Today felt different, though she could not articulate tense why, some tension in the air that made her skin prickle, made her wolf, that buried, suppressed part of herself she barely remembered having, stir restlessly in the cage of her chest. The breakfast, when it came, arrived with unusual accompaniment. The servant girl, young and perpetually frightened, lingering for a moment, eyes darting to the open door behind her, mouth working soundlessly before words finally emerged in a whisper that Neve had to strain to hear. "The Alpha King arrives tomorrow for the Unity Council," the girl said, hands shaking as she set down the tray with its meager portion of bread and thin soup. Everyone must attend, even hidden daughters. Then she fled, footsteps echoing up the stone stairs, leaving Neve alone with information that felt simultaneously meaningless and earth-shattering. A crack in the routine that had defined her existence for so long, she had almost forgotten routines could be broken. The Alpha King, she thought, testing the words, searching for recognition that did not come. Only that strange stirring again, that sense of something waiting, something about to shift, in ways she could not predict or prepare for, could only endure the way she endured everything else, with silence and survival, and the grim determination that had kept her breathing through 2,920 days of a life that felt less like living and more like the longest, slowest death imaginable. The chaos began before dawn, footsteps thundering overhead in patterns Neve had never heard before, voices raised not in anger, but in frantic preparation, the entire estate suddenly alive with an energy that filtered down even to her forgotten corner of the world, making the very stones seem to vibrate with anticipation. She sat on her cot, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of activity, trying to understand what it meant. Why today felt different from the 8 years of sameness that had preceded it. Why her heart was beating faster. Why the collar felt tighter. Why her wolf was clawing at her insides with an urgency that bordered on panic. The door, when she finally gathered courage to test it, swung open, unlocked in the confusion of preparation. An oversight so profound she stood frozen for several minutes, certain it was a trap, a test, another of her father's lessons disguised as opportunity. But the hallway beyond remained empty, and the pull, that inexplicable need to move, to climb, to see daylight for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, finally overcame her fear, sent her up the stone stairs on bare feet that had forgotten how to navigate anywhere except the 12 paces of her cell. The light hurt, stabbing through her eyes into her brain, forcing her to stop on the landing, one hand pressed against cool plaster, breathing through the nausea that accompanied sensory input her system was no longer equipped to process. Sound crashed over her in waves, voices and footsteps and the clatter of dishes, the rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards, 1,000 small noises that added up to overwhelming proof of life happening just beyond where she had been buried alive. The smells were worse, or better, she could not decide. Food cooking, real food, meat and bread and something sweet that made her stomach cramp with longing. And beneath it all, the scent of wolves, dozens of them, pack members moving through the house in preparation for something significant, something that required her father's best behavior, his careful presentation of power and respectability and control. She meant to retreat, truly she did, meant to return to the basement before anyone noticed her absence, before punishment found her, as it always did, swift and certain and creatively painful. But her feet carried her forward instead, drawn by curiosity or defiance or simple desperate need to prove to herself that a world existed beyond stone walls, that she had not imagined everything that came before the collar, before the darkness, before she became something to be hidden and ashamed of. The main hall opened before her, vast and bright and crowded with wolves she did not recognize. servants arranging flowers and polishing silver, and laying out refreshments with the kind of precision that spoke to the importance of whatever was about to occur. No one noticed her at first, just another shadow in a house full of movement, and she might have made it back down the stairs, might have avoided the consequences that were surely coming, except that the air pressure changed, dropped like before a summer storm, and every wolf in the hall went still, turned toward the entrance, toward the massive double doors that were swinging open to admit the Alpha King and his entourage. Connell Stormridge entered the way natural disasters entered, inevitable and overwhelming and absolutely impossible to ignore. His physical presence somehow larger than his actual size, though he was easily the tallest person Neve had ever seen, topping 6.5 feet, shoulders broad enough to block the doorway, moving with the kind of fluid grace that came from absolute confidence in his own power, in his right to occupy whatever space he chose. His hair was black, long enough to brush his collar, pulled back from a face that was all hard angles and sharp focus. And his eyes, those eyes that found hers across the crowded hall with the precision of an arrow finding its target, were the color of molten amber, of honey held up to sunlight, of something ancient and inhuman and absolutely, terrifyingly awake. The bond snapped into place between one heartbeat and the next, a sensation like lightning striking her chest, like chains wrapping around her soul, like falling and flying and drowning all at once. Every fragmented piece of herself that had been scattered and suppressed suddenly pulled toward a center she had not known existed, an anchor she had not known she was desperately, critically missing. The collar burned, flared hot enough to sear, and she gasped, stumbled, would have fallen, except that she was frozen, locked in place by golden eyes that had gone wide with recognition, with something that looked like shock and hunger and a possessiveness so intense it should have terrified her, but instead felt right, felt like the first true thing she had experienced in 8 years of carefully constructed lies. His wolf surged forward. She could see it in the way his pupils dilated, in the flash of something inhuman behind his gaze, in the low growl that started in his chest and reverberated through the hall, making every other wolf present drop their eyes, lower their heads, respond to the alpha command that was not words but pure dominance, pure power asserting itself without conscious thought or control. He moved toward her, 3 steps that ate up the distance between them, and she should have run, should have remembered her place, remembered that looking at people brought punishment, that drawing attention was the worst thing she could possibly do. But her body would not obey, would only stand there trembling, breathing in his scent of pine and winter and something wild that made her wolf keen with longing. Mate, something inside her whispered, a voice she had not heard in so long it felt like resurrection, like pieces of herself returning from exile. Mate, mine, ours, finally, the words tumbling over each other in desperate relief, in recognition that transcended logic or reason, or the careful numbness she had cultivated to survive. "Step away from her," Betta William Harlow said, appearing between them with the kind of speed that spoke to his own significant power, his face arranged in apologetic concern that did not quite reach his cold green eyes, his hand closing around Neve's upper arm hard enough to bruise, to remind her exactly what happened to daughters who forgot their place. "Alpha King, forgive this intrusion. My daughter is unwell, not fit for company, not meant to be seen. She should not have left her rooms." "Your daughter," Connell repeated, voice barely human, rough with the effort of keeping his wolf contained, of not shifting right there in the hall and tearing apart anyone who stood between him and what his entire being was screaming was his, was mate, was the other half of his soul that he had stopped believing existed. The words were not a question, but a statement loaded with threat, with promise, with the kind of certainty that came from instinct older and deeper than civilization. Neve tried to speak, tried to explain or apologize or something, but William's grip tightened, a warning, a reminder that she had stepped so far out of line there would be consequences beyond anything she had previously endured, and the words died in her throat, reduced to a small sound of pain that made Connell's eyes flash pure gold, made his hands curl into fists, made the air around him shimmer with barely contained violence. She watched him fight for control, watched him struggle against every instinct demanding he removed the threat, touching his mate, claiming ownership of what belonged to him alone. And some distant part of her mind marveled that anyone could look at her, scarred and broken, and wearing a collar that marked her as less than, and see something worth fighting for, worth claiming, worth this earth-shaking recognition. William dragged her back to the basement with a violence that left new bruises. Is blooming across her skin, threw her against the stone wall hard enough that her vision sparked and dimmed. And for the first time in 8 years, she saw genuine fear beneath his rage, saw something in his expression that looked almost like panic, like a carefully constructed plan suddenly threatened by forces he had not anticipated and could not control. "What did you do?" he hissed, fingers wrapping around her throat just below the collar, squeezing until black spots danced at the edges of her sight. "What did you do?" he hissed. "What did he see in you? What did you show him? You ruined everything, you stupid, defective creature." She could not answer, could barely breathe, could only focus on the burning in her chest that had nothing to do with lack of oxygen and everything to do with the bond that had settled there like a coal, still smoldering, still impossibly present, even as distance separated her from the man whose amber eyes had looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth something, beyond pain and shame and endless isolation. Her wolf was howling, clawing, fighting against the suppression magic woven into the silver collar with a desperation that brought tears streaming down her face, salt mixing with blood from where her head had struck stone. William left her locked in darkness, but the punishment felt different now, felt temporary rather than eternal, because something fundamental had shifted, some certainty broken by the evidence that she was not what he had told her she was, not defective or shameful or deserving of this treatment, because an alpha king, the alpha king, had looked at her and recognized mate, had fought his own instincts to keep from tearing apart anyone who touched her. She curled on her cot, fingers pressed against her sternum where the bond pulsed warm and insistent, and let herself cry, not from pain, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 floors above, Connell's Stormridge stood in the guest quarters, destroying furniture with methodical precision, needing the violence, needing the outlet for rage and confusion and protective instinct that had nearly made him shift in front of 24 witnesses, that had nearly started a war right there in William Harlow's entrance hall. Fenton Cross, his gamma and closest friend since childhood, watched from the doorway with the careful stillness of someone trying not to provoke a feral animal, waiting for the storm to pass, for rational thought to return to eyes that kept flashing gold, kept threatening transformation. "What happened?" Fenton asked finally, when the last chair had been reduced to kindling, when Connell stood breathing hard in the wreckage, hands bleeding from splinters he had not noticed acquiring. "You need to breathe, brother. You need to tell me what I just witnessed." "Mate," Connell said, the word torn from somewhere primal, somewhere beyond language or logic. After 7 years of ruling alone, of assuming I would never find her, she was just standing there, terrified and scarred, and wearing a collar that reeks of dark magic. And that bastard called her daughter, called her defective, put his hands on her like he had the right. His voice cracked, shifted toward growl. "I wanted to kill him, Fenton. I have never wanted anything more than I wanted to tear out his throat for touching what is mine." The beta's daughter, Fenton said slowly, processing, cataloging, already shifting into the strategic thinking that made him invaluable. I have never heard mention of William having a child, never seen records, never heard gossip. If she exists, he has kept her remarkably hidden. Find out everything, Connell ordered, forcing control back into his voice through sheer will, dragging his wolf back from the edge with effort that left him shaking. Her name, her history, why she wears that collar, why she smells like fear and pain and magic that should not exist. Find out what William Harlow is hiding, and do it before I lose what is left of my control and do something that starts a civil war. The investigation took 3 days. 3 days during which Connell attended Unity Council meetings with a focus that fooled no one. 3 days during which he felt the bond like a compass, pointing toward the woman locked somewhere below, calling to him, pulling at him, making concentration nearly impossible. Fenton worked with quiet efficiency, interviewing servants who, suddenly, remembered a girl kept in isolation, a daughter who was never permitted at gatherings, never mentioned except in whispers, always described as sickly, as disturbed, as something shameful that the beta bore with saintly patience. But there were no birth records, no documentation, nothing official, until 8 years ago, when she appeared. Appeared in the registry fully formed at age 15, listed simply as Neve Harlow, status classified, needs accommodations for unspecified illness. Before that, nothing, as though she had materialized from nowhere, as though her entire existence prior to that moment had been erased with the same thorough precision as everything that followed. On the second day, Connell visited Vera Moss in her cottage at the edge of Pack territory, the ancient healer who had served his father Magnus, who knew old magic and older secrets, who looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. He asked her about memory suppression, about collars that bound and controlled, about ways to make someone forget who they were, what they had been, everything that mattered. Vera studied him in the firelight, hunched and tiny and radiating a power that had nothing to do with physical strength, everything to do with knowledge accumulated across 73 years of watching Pack politics, of treating wounds both visible and hidden, of keeping secrets that could destroy families if spoken aloud. Dark magic, she said finally, voice like dry leaves rustling. Blood magic, the kind that requires sacrifice and intention and cruelty that most wolves would not stomach. Memory alteration, identity binding, suppression of the wolf itself, these things are possible but forbidden, have been forbidden since before your grandfather's time, since the wars that nearly destroyed us all. Could it be broken? Connell asked, leaning forward, desperate for answers that might help him understand, might help him free his mate from whatever prison William had constructed. Could someone recover from that kind of magic? Vera was quiet for a long moment, studying the flames, reading patterns he could not interpret. Some truths are buried with blood magic, Alpha King, she said carefully, as though weighing each word. Some disappearances were never explained. Some deaths never properly investigated because the grief was too raw, the politics too complicated. Your father Magnus died 7 years ago, and with him died many questions about what happened in the months before, about loyal wolves who vanished, about the beta who served him faithfully and then died shortly after, about that beta's true mate who disappeared. Connell went very still, pieces clicking. Licking into place with sickening clarity. Aldrich, he said quietly, naming the man who had been his father's most trusted beta, who had supported Connell's claim to leadership when others would have preferred a power struggle, who had died under suspicious circumstances that were never fully investigated because war had been raging and attention was elsewhere. Aldrich Stormridge was beta to your father, and a better man I never knew, Vera continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory, of grief still sharp despite the years that had passed. He had a true mate, Lysandra Winterbourne, from the old bloodline, the white wolves that once ran these mountains before we drove them to near extinction with our wars and our hunger for territory. They had a daughter, a child with silver hair and ice-blue eyes, a girl who would be 23 now if she lived, if she survived what came after. Connell felt the world tilt, felt certainty settle into his bones with the inevitability of gravity. "William was third in command under my father," he said slowly, connecting threads that should have been visible years ago if he had thought to look, if grief and responsibility had not consumed his attention. "When my father died and I took the crown, there were those who thought me too young, too inexperienced, who wanted to challenge my claim. Aldrich stood with me, vouched for me, used his influence to prevent civil war. And 6 months later, Aldrich and his mate were found dead," Vera finished, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows across her weathered face. "Killed in what was ruled a rogue attack, though the wounds never sat right with me, though I wondered at the timing, at the convenience. Their daughter vanished that same night, presumed taken by the rogues, presumed dead because no child could survive what killed 2 full-grown wolves in their prime. Except Alpha King, what if she did not die? What if someone took her, bound her, made her forget everything she was so she could never challenge him, never reveal what she witnessed, never claim justice for parents murdered to prevent them from exposing a traitor?" The rage that filled Connell was cold, calculating, the kind that did not explode outward but compressed inward, forging itself into purpose, into determination that would not bend or break until justice was served. William Harlow, murdered Eldrick to silence him, murdered Lysandra to eliminate the Winterbourne bloodline, took their daughter as insurance, as leverage, as a victim he could torture for years without consequence, because everyone believed her dead. "I suspected," Vera admitted, guilt threading through her words. "The timing of the deaths, the sudden appearance of William's sick daughter 8 years ago, a girl no one was permitted to see, a girl who wore a collar I felt once when I was called to treat a fever, felt the dark magic woven into silver and could do nothing, without proof, without power, without risking that William would simply kill her and dispose of the evidence. I have been researching counterspells for 7 years, Alpha King, preparing for an opportunity that only came when your bond gave her the strength to fight the suppression, to crack the bindings holding her memories." Connell stood, decision made, course set, the weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders the way it always did when duty demanded action regardless of personal cost. "I am calling an emergency Unity Council vote tonight," he said, voice hard with authority that permitted no argument. "William will be there, and so will his daughter, because she has the right to face the council, to be seen, to exist as something other than a shameful secret locked in a basement." "That is dangerous," Vera warned, rising to follow him to the door. "If William suspects you know the truth, if he believes exposure is imminent, he may decide a dead witness is safer than a living one. The collar has spells I have not fully unraveled, kill switches woven into the magic that could stop her heart with a single word." "Then we move carefully," Connell said, stepping into afternoon light that seemed too bright, too ordinary for the fury burning in his chest. "But we move. I will not leave my mate in his hands another day, will not permit her to suffer another hour for crimes committed against her family, against my father's most loyal beta, against the memory of wolves who died protecting what was right." The Unity Council convened in the Great Hall as evening fell, tension thick enough to taste. 5 pack leaders and their seconds arranged around the massive oak table that had been carved from a single tree over a century ago, a symbol of strength and unity that felt hollow tonight, felt like a stage. Revenge for betrayal that had been years in the making. Connell sat at the head, Fenton at his right, watching William Harlow settle into his seat with the easy confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable, who had played this game so long he no longer remembered it was possible to lose. "I have asked the beta to bring his daughter tonight. Connell said without preamble, watching William's expression freeze, watching calculation flash behind those cold green eyes. She is a member of this pack, entitled to witness the proceedings, entitled to be acknowledged rather than hidden as though her existence brings shame. Alpha King, William began, voice smooth, reasonable, the tone of someone explaining simple facts to a stubborn child. My daughter is fragile. Her condition makes public gatherings difficult. The excitement could trigger episodes that would distress her, distress everyone present. Surely it is kinder to permit her to remain in her rooms where she is comfortable, where she is safe. I insist, Connell said softly, letting his alpha power leak into the words, making them command rather than request, making it clear this was not negotiable, not subject to debate or delay. Bring her now, Beta Harlow, or I will retrieve her myself, and I do not think either of us wants that particular confrontation in front of witnesses. The threat hung in the air, clear to everyone present, the other pack leaders exchanging glances that spoke to confusion and curiosity and the beginnings of understanding that something was happening beneath the surface, some drama playing out that they were only now being permitted to glimpse. William left without another word, returning 15 minutes later with Neve, his hand wrapped around her upper arm in a grip that looked supportive but was clearly restraint, clearly control. She wore a high-necked dress that covered the collar, covered most of the scars, but Connell could see them anyway, could see the way she moved carefully, as though her body was something that caused pain, something that had been taught through repeated suffering that drawing attention brought consequences. Their eyes met across the room, and the bond flared hot and bright, making his wolf surge forward, making control a physical effort that left him shaking. She looked terrified and defiant in equal measure, looked like she was expecting punishment, but had decided it was worth it, whatever happened next, just to be seen, just to exist in a space beyond her prison. The council meeting proceeded with excruciating formality, discussion of territory disputes and resource allocation and trade agreements that meant nothing to Neve, who sat silent in the corner chair William had directed her to, hands folded in her lap, eyes down in the posture of submission that had been beaten into her over 2,920 days of captivity. But beneath the careful blankness, her mind was racing, processing the weight of amber eyes that kept finding her across the room, the presence of the Alpha King who had called her mate with a certainty that defied logic, the strange electric pull in her chest that made her want to move closer, to close the distance, to do something monumentally stupid that would surely result in punishment beyond anything she had previously endured. The servant girl found her during a recess, pressed a folded slip of paper into her palm with shaking fingers, and disappeared before Neve could react, before she could ask questions or refuse the dangerous gift. She waited until William was distracted in conversation with another beta, until his attention was elsewhere and his grip on her had loosened, before unfolding the note with hands that trembled, reading words that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. They plan to kill him tonight, during the vote, the Alpha King. They will blame you. The world narrowed to those 12 words, to the impossible choice they represented: stay silent and safe, or speak and risk everything, betray her father and face consequences that might include death, or save the man her soul recognized as mate, as the other half of herself she had not known existed until 3 days ago. Her wolf was screaming at her, clawing at the cage of suppression magic, demanding she protect what was theirs, what they could not lose now that they had found it. And for the first time in 8 years, Neve made a choice that was entirely her own, stepped outside the bounds of learned helplessness, and decided that some things were worth dying for. She moved during the chaos of council members returning to their seats, slipped through a servant's entrance she had noticed earlier, navigated hallways on feet that remembered the layout from her single glimpse days before. Fenton Cross stood guard outside the council chamber, massive and alert, and radiating the kind of competence that made her simultaneously grateful and terrified, because if she was wrong, if this was somehow a test or a trap or a mistake born of desperate hope rather than reality, he would be the one to stop her, to return her to William, to ensure she faced punishment for this final, fatal transgression. "You have to stop the vote," she said, voice barely above a whisper, unused to speaking to anyone except herself, unused to being heard or acknowledged or taken seriously. "They are going to kill him," the Alpha King. "During the vote, they will strike, and you have to stop them." Fenton's hand went to the blade at his hip, warrior instincts engaging, body shifting into readiness, even as his eyes assessed her, catalogued her fear and determination, and the collar glinting at her throat. "How do you know this?" he asked, not dismissing her, not assuming she was mad or lying or mistaken, giving her the gift of being treated as though her words carried weight, as though she was someone whose warnings mattered. "Because my father has been planning this since before I learned what pain truly meant," Neve said, and the words felt like treason, felt like freedom, felt like stepping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. "Because I have listened to him speak when he thought I was too broken to understand, too suppressed to remember, and I know he intends to take the crown by force, to remove the obstacle that stands between him and the power he believes he deserves." The council chamber erupted into chaos seconds after Fenton burst through the doors, shouting warnings that came heartbeats too late because William Harlow was already moving, wolfsbane raised blade appearing in his hand with the smooth practice of someone who had planned this moment down to the last detail, who had waited years for the perfect opportunity to strike. Other conspirators revealed themselves in the same breath. 3 pack leaders who had chafed under Connell's rule, who wanted the old ways of territorial division rather than unified packs, who saw assassination as a viable path to power. Fenton intercepted the blade meant for Connell's unguarded back, took the strike across his shoulder rather than let it find the Alpha King's heart. The poison burned, made him stumble, made his wolf howl in agony that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Connell moved with the speed of instinct and training, catching his gamma before he fell, lowering him carefully while his eyes tracked threats, while his power flooded the space, making every wolf present feel the weight of their alpha's rage, the promise of violence barely contained beneath civilized veneer. William grabbed Neve during the confusion, hauled her against his chest with the blade now pressed to her throat, using her as shield, as hostage, as the insurance he had always known she would be if everything went wrong. The silver burned where it touched her skin, made her gasp, made the collar flare hot in response to her distress, activating the punishment protocols William had encoded into the metal 8 years ago. Partial shift rippled through Connell's frame, bones cracking and reforming, spine arching, teeth elongating into fangs, designed for tearing, for killing, for protecting what was his against any threat regardless of cost. His voice, when he spoke, was barely human, more growl than language, pure alpha command that brought every wolf except William to their knees involuntarily, forced submission through sheer dominance that permitted no resistance, no choice, no option except obedience. "You dare draw weapon in my presence," he snarled, advancing one careful step, then another, watching the blade at Neve's emote, calculating angles and distances and the risk of movement, of action, of the violence his wolf was screaming for. "You dare threaten what is mine." The collar was burning, cutting into Neve's throat, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, and through the pain she felt memories rising, forcing themselves past the suppression magic that was destabilizing under the pressure of Connell's power, under the strain of the bond pulling between them. She saw her father, her real father, a man with kind eyes teaching her to track through snow. She saw her mother, white wolf magnificent in moonlight, singing in a language that sounded like home. She saw love and safety and belonging. And then she saw William, saw the blade entering her father's chest, saw her mother dying to protect her, saw the collar snapping around her neck, saw 8 years of torture designed to break her, to make her forget, to ensure.
For she could never challenge him, never reveal his crimes, never claim justice for parents murdered for loyalty, for honor, for standing beside their alpha king when others would have chosen treason. "I remember," Neve screamed, the words tearing from her throat despite the blade, despite the pain, despite 8 years of conditioning that said silence was survival, that speaking brought punishment, that her voice did not matter and never would. "I remember everything. My name is Neve Winterbourne. You killed my parents. You murdered Aldrich Stormridge and Lysandra Winterbourne. You stole everything from me." William's hand tightened on the blade, panic finally showing in his eyes, the careful mask of control cracking to reveal the monster beneath. The man who had tortured a child for 8 years to protect his own ambitions, to hide crimes that would have seen him executed if they had come to light. "One more step and she dies," he said, voice pitched to carry, to convince, to make them all understand he had nothing left to lose. "I will speak the word and the collar will stop her heart. I will end her before I let you have her, before I let her destroy everything I have built." The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Connell frozen between need and strategy, between the screaming demands of his wolf and the cold calculation of his mind that knew rushing forward would result in Neve's death, would give William exactly what he wanted, would end the mate bond before it had truly begun. But Vera Moss was chanting, low words in the old language, counter magic designed to destabilize the collar's bindings, to give Neve a chance, however slim, to break free of the prison that had held her for so long. "Trust me," Connell's voice whispered in her mind, the first time the bond had carried thought between them, the first time she heard him inside her head where William could not follow, could not intercept, could not control. "When I move, close your eyes, let your wolf rise, let her break what should never have been forged." Neve did not understand, could not process how to access a wolf she barely remembered having, a part of herself that had been locked away so thoroughly she had almost forgotten it existed. But desperation was its own kind of teacher, and the bond was warm in her chest, an anchor she could hold to, a source of strength she could draw from. She reached for the wolf inside her, found her pacing and snarling and ready, found power that had been suppressed but never destroyed, found the daughter of Lysandra Winterbourne who was stronger than any magic a traitor could weave. The transformation hit like an avalanche, like every bone in her body breaking simultaneously, like her skin was too small and her skeleton was expanding, reshaping, becoming something other than human, something ancient and powerful and absolutely done with cages. The collar burned, cut deeper, the kill switch magic activating as William spoke the word in a language that tasted of blood and sacrifice. But Neve's wolf was rising, white and massive and furious, and the magic could not hold against bloodline that predated the collar's creation, against power that came from a time when white wolves ruled these mountains and lesser creatures bowed before them. The collar shattered in an explosion of silver fragments and discharged magic, the backlash throwing William across the room, slamming him into the wall hard enough to crack stone. Neve stood in wolf form for the first time in 8 years, for the first time since she was 15, and still learning what it meant to have two shapes, two selves that were somehow one being. She was larger than any female wolf should be, shoulder height nearly matching the male's, fur pure white without a single dark marking, eyes ice blue and utterly focused on the man who had stolen her life, who had murdered her parents, who had taught her that existence meant suffering.
William scrambled for the blade, pulled a second weapon from his boot, something ancient and wicked that smelled of old magic, of alpha-killing curses, of desperation made manifest. Connell met him in the space between heartbeats, human form, because this needed to be personal, needed to be justice delivered with intention rather than animal fury, needed to be the execution of a traitor rather than a simple killing. They crashed together with the kind of violence that spoke to years of suppressed suspicion, to the weight of betrayal finally acknowledged, to rage that had no outlet except combat. The fight was brutal, trained skill against desperate cunning, alpha power against the dirty tricks of someone who had spent decades surviving through manipulation and murder. William landed cuts that what would have killed a lesser wolf, that burned with poison and dark magic. But Connell fought through pain the way he had fought through everything else in 7 years of ruling fractious packs, with grim determination that would not bend, would not break, would not stop until justice was served. Neve watched with wolf eyes, instincts screaming at her to join, to protect her mate, to ensure the threat was eliminated. But Connell's command held her still, kept her from interfering in something that needed to happen this way, that needed to be Alpha King executing traitor rather than mate bond defense. But when William nearly landed the killing blow, when the cursed blade swept toward Connell's unguarded throat, she moved anyway, could not stop herself, could not watch him die when she had just found him. White Wolf tackled William, brought him down with fangs at his throat, with enough pressure to puncture skin, but not kill, not yet, not without permission. Connell stood over them both, bleeding from a dozen wounds, breathing hard, amber eyes assessing the scene with calculation that was returning now that immediate threat was neutralized. He shifted back to human, unconcerned with nakedness, focused entirely on the choice that needed to be made, the justice that needed to be served. "He is yours to judge, mate," Connell said, voice rough but steady, giving her the power, the authority, the right to decide the fate of the man who had destroyed her childhood, who had stolen 8 years she could never recover. As daughter of those he murdered, as the one he tortured, his life is yours to take or spare. Neve could feel it, the fragile give of William's throat beneath her fangs. How easy it would be to bite down, to end him, to taste the justice she had dreamed of in the darkest hours of her captivity. But standing there in wolf form, feeling the bond warm in her chest, feeling her mate's pride and trust flowing through their connection, she made a choice that was not about revenge or violence or reducing herself to his level. She released him, stepped back, shifted to human form with effort that left her shaking, that reminded her she was still learning this body, still remembering what it meant to have choices, to have power, to have voice. "I want him to face every pack member he betrayed," she said, voice hoarse from screaming, from years of disuse. "I want his crimes spoken aloud. I want the truth known. I want justice rather than revenge. I want him to live with what he did, rather than escape into death." The great hall of Storm Ridge Pack Center had not seen this many wolves in living memory. Hundreds crowded into a space designed for dozens. Pack members from all 5 territories standing shoulder to shoulder, silent and waiting, the air thick with tension and curiosity, and the beginning understanding that something fundamental was about to shift, that history was being made in real time, and they were witnesses to transformation. Neve stood at the center of it all, flanked by Connell on her right and Vera on her left, wearing a simple dress that did nothing to hide the scars marking her arms and shoulders, the angry red line where the collar had cut into her throat, the visible evidence of 8 years of systematic torture. She had not wanted to do this, had argued with Connell that her truth was private, that speaking it aloud would require reliving every moment of suffering, that some things were better left buried where they could not hurt anymore. But he had held her gently, had reminded her that silence protects abusers, that William's crimes would be minimized and forgotten if no one understood the full scope of his betrayal, that other victims existed in shadows because no one had been brave enough to speak first, to make it safe, to prove that survival was not something to be ashamed of. "My name is Neve Winterbourne," she began, voice shaking but audible, carrying to the edges of the assembled crowd. "I am the daughter of Aldrich Stormridge, Beta to Alpha King Magnus, and Lysandra Winterbourne of the White Wolf bloodline. 8 years ago, when I was 15 years old, William Harlow murdered my parents to prevent them from exposing his plans to overthrow the crown, to seize power he had not earned and did not deserve." The crowd stirred, murmurs rising and falling like waves, shock and disbelief rippling through wolves who had known William as respected Beta, as trusted advisor, as someone who projected honor rather than the monster standing now in silver chains, face blank, calculating, even in captivity. Neve forced herself to continue, to detail the night of her parents' deaths, the silver blade through her father's heart, her mother dying to protect her, the collar snapping around her neck as William spoke words that tasted of blood magic, that made her forget her name, her family, everything that had come before that moment of violation. "He kept me in the basement of his estate for 2,920 days, she said, numbers that felt important, that represented time stolen, life suspended, suffering measured in increments of darkness and pain. He burned me with silver when I looked at visitors, carved runes into my back to weaken my wolf, kept me in isolation because he said I was defective, damaged, shameful, something that needed to be hidden from sight. He used magic to suppress my memories, to make me forget I was anything except his broken daughter, his burden, his victim." The details came slowly, painfully, each word feeling like removing a splinter embedded too deep, but she spoke them anyway, described the single meal per day, the windowless room, the careful rationing of candle stubs, the books she read until pages fell apart from repeated handling, the conversations with herself to maintain sanity, the scars that had their own stories, their own lessons about what happened to girls who forgot their place. She did not flinch from the horror of it, did not soften the edges to make it easier for her audience to hear, because William had not softened anything for her, had not shown mercy or restraint or the smallest consideration for her humanity. Pack members were crying openly now, some turning away because they could not bear to hear more, others leaning forward because they needed to understand, needed to know the full scope of betrayal committed by someone they had trusted, someone who had walked among them wearing the mask of respectability while torturing a child in his basement. Connell stood rigid beside her, partially shifted, fighting for control, as her words painted pictures of suffering that made his wolf howl for vengeance, for violence, for the satisfaction of tearing apart the monster who had hurt his mate so thoroughly, so systematically, so deliberately. William's trial proceeded with the cold efficiency of justice too long delayed, evidence presented in meticulous detail, testimonies from servants who had suspected but been too afraid to speak, magical analysis of the shattered collar proving its dark origins, Neff's financial records showing payments to conspirators, correspondence revealing the scope of the plot that had cost 2 lives and destroyed a third. The other conspirators turned on each other with the predictable desperation of rats fleeing a sinking vessel. 3 pack leaders who had participated in the assassination attempt now claiming ignorance, claiming they had not understood William's true intentions, claiming mercy they had not earned and did not deserve. Margot Vale sat among the prisoners, auburn hair disheveled, expensive dress torn, face that had been beautiful now twisted with bitterness and rage and the dawning realization that her ambitions had led not to power but to destruction. She tried to bargain, offered information in exchange for exile rather than execution, claimed she had not known about Nev, had not understood the depths of William's crimes, had only wanted to be Luna, to stand beside the Alpha King, to claim a position she believed was rightfully hers through persistence and political maneuvering. "You did not ask," Neve said, stepping forward to face the woman who had helped plot Connell's murder, who had conspired with a child torturer, who had valued power over truth, ambition over justice. "You did not care. You saw what you wanted to see, believed what was convenient to believe, and ignorance chosen deliberately is just another word for complicity." The sentencing came with the weight of tradition, pack law that stretched back centuries, dictating that traitors who murdered their alpha faced execution by the new alpha's hand, justice delivered swiftly and without ceremony, a reminder that some crimes were beyond redemption, beyond mercy, beyond anything except final punishment. But Neve stepped forward again, claimed the ancient right of justice debt, the law that permitted a victim's family to set terms when blood had been spilled, when murder had been committed, when traditional sentences seemed insufficient for crimes that had shattered multiple lives. "William Harlow will live," she said, words falling into absolute silence, every wolf present leaning forward to hear, to understand, to process this unexpected mercy. "He will live as I lived, bound in silver, in darkness, in isolation, with only his guilt for company, for 8 years as I suffered, and then the pack will decide if he deserves death or exile."
Exile or some other fate I cannot imagine from this side of his punishment. 6 weeks transformed more than Neve had believed possible in such a brief span of time. 6 weeks during which her body remembered what it meant to eat regularly, to sleep without fear of midnight punishments, to move through sunlit rooms without expecting violence for the transgression of existing. The scars remained, would always remain, raised lines across her shoulders and arms that told their own story. But Vera's salves helped them fade from angry red to pale silver, helped the tissue soften, helped the pain recede to manageable levels that did not define every moment of every day. Her hair grew longer, lustrous, no longer the dull, brittle strands of malnutrition, and her face filled out, cheekbones less prominent, eyes less hollowed, the physical markers of starvation slowly erased by consistent care and the simple, revolutionary act of being fed. She trained with Fenton in the mornings, learning to fight, to shift at will rather than only in moments of desperate crisis, to use the Luna authority that came with her bond to Connell, the power to command and protect and lead that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, as though she was remembering rather than learning, reclaiming rather than discovering. Fenton was patient in ways she had not expected from someone so obviously built for violence, correcting her stance with gentle adjustments, praising small victories, never pushing beyond what she could handle, but always encouraging her to reach slightly further, to test boundaries that were expanding daily. The afternoons belonged to Packlaw, to sitting beside Connell in his study while he explained the intricate web of regulations and traditions that governed wolf society, pointing out the archaic statutes that had enabled her abuse, that had allowed William to hide crimes in plain sight because no one thought to look, because privacy was valued over protection, because intervention was considered interference. Together they drafted reforms, mandatory reporting requirements, prohibition of long-term isolation, complete ban on collar magic regardless of claimed purpose, protections for wolves without families who might otherwise fall through cracks that had swallowed her so completely. But the evenings were theirs alone, time when Connell stopped being Alpha King and became simply her mate, when they learned each other slowly, carefully, two damaged souls finding wholeness in shared vulnerability. He touched her scars with reverent gentleness, tracing each line, learning the map of her pain, asking permission before every caress, making certain she understood that her body was hers, that intimacy was choice rather than obligation,
that healing happened at her pace rather than his need. She traced the tension in his shoulders in return, felt the weight of 7 years ruling alone, of responsibility that never lifted, of isolation that was different from hers, but no less profound. And they talked through nights about everything and nothing, about her parents and his father, about the weight of crowns and the price of survival, about building something better from the wreckage of what had been. The sanctuary opened on a morning that smelled of pine and approaching winter. The Harlow estate transformed from prison to refuge, from place of suffering to space of healing. Every room stripped of William's presence and rebuilt with intention, with purpose, with the understanding that environments shaped recovery, that safety needed to be felt before it could be believed. Neve stood in the basement one last time before the ceremony, the space unrecognizable now, chains removed, locks dismantled, windows cut into stone walls that had held only darkness, letting in light that felt like absolution, like proof that transformation was possible, that nothing was so broken it could not be remade. The speech she gave at the opening was brief, words coming easier now after weeks of practice, after learning that her voice mattered, that people would listen if she spoke, that silence protected abusers while truth freed victims. "I survived because I had to," she said, addressing the dozen wolves who had come forward in the wake of her testimony, who had revealed their own stories of abuse and neglect and systematic cruelty that had festered in shadows. But survival should not be the best we offer our people, the highest achievement we recognize, the only goal we celebrate. You deserve to live, truly live, to thrive rather than merely endure. And this place exists to help you remember that truth, to give you tools and time and community that makes healing possible. Connell stood beside her during the ceremony. Ceremony, hand in hers, solid and warm and absolutely certain, his pride flowing through their bond like sunlight, like the first deep breath after drowning, like coming home to a place she had never known existed but recognized immediately as belonging. The pack had questioned the match initially, whispered about whether she was stable enough, strong enough, prepared for the demands of being Luna. But 6 weeks of watching her transform, of seeing her courage, of witnessing her choose justice over vengeance, mercy over cruelty, healing over hatred, had silenced most doubts, had proven that strength came in forms beyond physical power, that leadership was built on character rather than dominance. They visited her parents' graves together on the first day of true winter, snow falling in soft silence, the world muffled and clean and impossibly beautiful in ways she had forgotten during 8 years of basement darkness. Connell had buried them in a hidden clearing at the edge of pack territory, marked their resting place with simple stones carved with their names, had tended the site for 7 years without ever knowing he was caring for his mate's family, for the wolves who had saved his crown, for the parents stolen from a girl who deserved better than she had received. Neve knelt in snow that soaked through her dress, left white winter roses that had been her mother's favorite, and spoke to them for the first time, with recovered memories, with full understanding of what had been lost, what could never be reclaimed. "I survived," she said, words coming slowly, carefully, weighted with grief that was still sharp despite time past, despite healing begun. "I found my mate. I am making the pack better. I am trying to honor what you taught me about justice and mercy and choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. You can rest now. You can stop worrying. I am safe and loved and becoming who I was meant to be." Connell's hand found hers, silent support that asked nothing, offered everything, and they stood together until sunset painted the snow gold and amber, until cold seeped through layers and reminded them that life continued, that living required returning from places of memory and grief, that honoring the dead meant building futures they would have wanted. The winter festival arrived with the kind of joy Neve was still learning to accustom to. A process, still learning to trust. Celebration filling every corner of pack territory with music and laughter, and the casual affection of wolves who felt safe enough to relax, to play, to exist without constant vigilance. She stood on the balcony of the pack center, watching children race through snow, watching adults dance and feast, and simply be, feeling the weight of 8 years lift slightly, not disappearing, but becoming bearable, becoming part of her story rather than the entirety of her identity. "What are you thinking?" Connell asked, appearing beside her with the silent grace of someone who had spent decades moving through dangerous spaces, offering her a cup of something warm and spiced that smelled like celebration, like belonging, like home. "That I am grateful," Neve said honestly, leaning into his warmth, into the solid certainty of his presence, "for surviving, for finding you, for all of it, even the pain, because it led here, to this moment, to this life I am building, to the understanding that I am not defined by what was done to me, but by what I choose to do next." He kissed her then, passionate and tender in equal measure, promise and claiming and partnership, the bond between them blazing bright and certain, two halves of something that had been incomplete, finally made whole. The scars on her body would never fully fade, the memories would never fully quiet. The work of healing would continue for years, perhaps for her entire life. But Neve, Winterborn, had learned the most important truth of all, that she was not her trauma, not her suffering, not the broken thing William had tried to create, but something infinitely stronger, infinitely more valuable, infinitely more real. That night, she ran through snow in wolf form beside her mate, white wolf and black wolf, racing through moonlight, two equals, two survivors who had found each other against impossible odds, who had chosen love over hate, mercy over vengeance, life over the easier darkness of giving up. And in choosing, in continuing, in refusing to let William's cruelty define her future, Neve Winterborn became free in the truest sense. Free not because her chains were broken, but because she had learned that freedom was something built daily, through choice, through courage, through the revolutionary act of believing she deserved better, and then working to create it.